Our next speaker today has had an extraordinary career. Joe Noero and his practice, Noero Architects, have had to tread that extraordinary thin line between political and social responsibility, professional delivery, and certainly early in his career under a political system that was anathema to him and many other, though not all, professionals in South Africa. And Joe's going to talk today about a couple of commissions that I think really focus on this concept of togetherness, the theme of this series of talks. One from, I'll leave him to go into the details, but one was a black commissioning client, one was white. In both instances, the question was how to get a sense of togetherness, and in this case, togetherness as reconciliation in a post-apartheid condition where, you know, rather like wars with collaborators, so much bad blood, so much history, so many complicated relationships, that business of reconciliation, well, what part might architecture play in trying to achieve that? And what we're about to hear is how certainly two clients believed that that was possible, and we'll see how it was achieved. Joe Noero.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Paul, for that very nice introduction. I'm going to talk today about work that I did pre-1994 for Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I think is one of the great leaders in our country, and then a project that we completed recently in Cape Town for Dennis Goldberg, who was one of the Rivonia trialists and spent 24 years in jail. I think the extraordinary thing about Desmond Tutu is that early on in his career, he came over to the UK and he worked as a chaplain in London. And I think there are people here who might have remembered him from those days. And what he carried back to South Africa with him before he became Bishop of Johannesburg was this idea that the church, in conditions of inequality and difficult times, has a very important role to play. And the example that he always spoke about was the role that the Anglican Church played in the East End of London in the 19th century. And he particularly spoke about the work of Nicholas Hawksmoor. He'd been to Spitalfields, he loved the church, and for him that was a building that really represented a bringing together of people in a condition of dire poverty. And he spoke about that church at length. And by chance, I met Desmond Tutu, and he took an instant liking to me, and he appointed me as architect to the Transvaal Diocese of the Anglican Church. Well, I'm neither an Anglican nor a believer, but that didn't matter. And the fact that I was white made it even more salty for him. He liked that idea that he'd have a young white architect as the diocesan architect. So for 15 years, I did all kinds of work in the Anglican church community, and did some quite expensive churches, mainly low-cost churches, probably 40, 50 of them that are spread around the Transvaal. But I think many of those churches have now disappeared because they were built so cheaply out of corrugated sheeting that I don't think they had a life of more than 10, 15 years because we had no money. I'll quickly take you through, and these are the churches that really made an impression on Desmond Tutu, particularly the work of Hawksmoor. And he spoke about I don't know what it was something that touched him about these churches, and he could never believe that the Anglican Church would build these wonderful buildings in a sea of poverty. I put this up here, and I'm not trying to, blow my own trumpet, but he was going to open an exhibition of some of my work in Cape Town, And he couldn't make it because he had to make an overseas trip. So he wrote a piece about me and my relationship with him in the catalogue for the exhibition. And really, I think what he said to me, if you read up there, is he said, look, I really appreciate the work that you've done because you supported me in my desire to try and build beautiful churches in a condition of absolute ugliness and despairing quality. And he said that, in a sense, was to him a contribution to the liberation of our country. It was about making a manifest difference to the lives of black people, particularly in places like Soweto. And for me, that was the greatest compliment I could ever have. But the first project I ever did in my professional career was just at the time when Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he took a portion of his money and he built himself a small chapel at the back, in the backyard of his home in Soweto, which really used to be where they used to hang their washing out to dry. We never believed that we could build a small building that size in the backyard. And he was a deeply religious man, and he used to wake up at 4 every morning and pray and meditate for 2-3 hours. And that gave him a sense of what it was that he would do that day in the conduct of his life. And remember, this was at a time when the ANC government was banned in South Africa, and Desmond Tutu was one of the speakers of the people who were being oppressed by apartheid. And he was untouchable because he was a man of the cloth. He was a churchman, but also a Nobel Peace Prize winner meant that he had an authority that even the apartheid government found difficult to stifle. But it's a tiny little building. It's the chapel, which is here, is at the top end of the slide. It's 2 meters wide. So it's a space enough for just Desmond and his wife Leah and maybe 1 or 2 other people. And it was built, if you can believe it, it wasn't built to bring people together. I think it was built for Desmond to prepare himself for bringing other people outside of Soweto together. The first building that we did was a church which was placed on the site where Hector Peterson, who was the first kid who got killed in Soweto, in the 1976 uprising. It's where his parents and he worshipped, St. Paul's Anglican Church in White City, Jabavu. What's interesting about this place, though, is that there's a big monument that anyone who's been to South Africa will go to called Hector Peterson Memorial. And it's part of how we rewrite history because that building has nothing to do with where Hector Peterson was either killed or where he and his family worshipped. It was actually here. But the ANC decided that they would have Hector Peterson placed next to the house that Nelson Mandela lived in, which made it much easier for tourists who come to Soweto to do 2 things at the same time. And this is in a much more dangerous and less salubrious part of Soweto. But this was a church that we built. Again, this was the second building that I built, but it was a curious building because first of all, it was divided into 3 quadrants, as you can see, with a centralized altar. And the idea with this was that people would come from outside Soweto, ambassadorial staff, politicians, and others visiting South Africa, ostensibly to attend a church meeting, but in fact to meet the leadership who were in Soweto at the time. And they met around the church. And there were 2 languages that were used. One was isiXhosa and the other one was Zulu, to lead the church service, and we had to then add in English as well. So each one of those quadrants effectively represents a language, and these church service would take up to 2.5 hours because everything had to be repeated 3 times in order to be able to reach the different language groups. So the church form itself was generated in a way by this need to accommodate 3 different languages, but then to bringing people together very closely around the action that took place in the altar and to reinforce that idea of togetherness. It was a very simple church. I mean, we built it for literally nothing. We built it ourselves using local labor, and the priest, David Inkwe, who later became a very well-known bishop, went and bought all the materials. And this is the kind of services that we had. I mean, there was a huge, big courtyard. This is a community building, a Pelican Community Center built by German money after the 76 riots by German architects somewhere in Germany who had no idea of what South Africa was like, and it was a morbid set of buildings, really completely unsuitable to South Africa and to Soweto. But we had to live with it. And the interiors. So the other thing that I wanted to say was that what we were involved in was not only church buildings, but also other kinds of buildings, some of which were quite subversive. If you have a look in this drawing here on the bottom side, you'll see a rectangular building. And that was originally designed as a dormitory block for the community center. But it couldn't hold a large number of people because it was badly planned. And it had a huge, big roof volume, like a big hat placed on top of the rooms. And we needed to triple the accommodation in that small space. And it was intended as a place where returning ANC people would come and stay, usually in secret, and from there would move throughout South Africa. So what we had to do was effectively build this building subversively so that the local police, the security branch, and the building inspectors wouldn't know what we were doing. So what we did is we kept the roof, we gutted the inside of the building, and then prefabricated all the elements that went into it and brought them to site during the nighttime and then assembled them under the roof during the daytime. And that really was the only difference we made to the outside of the building was the roof lights that we put in the roof, which I don't think anyone recognized. So we managed to make this a safe house for a large number of people moving in and out of South Africa at a time when repression was at its height. And the space itself on the inside, as you can see, has a very strong prefabricated nature, which influenced a lot of the work we did subsequently. These wonderful seats were built by a local carpenter in White City, and he built them and then assembled them himself. As part of Desmond Tutu's prize money, he gave quite a bit to a rural church building program that we got involved in. And this is where we built most of our churches. And these were to be low-cost, effective churches that could be built very quickly, either out of concrete block or steel. And they were effectively like gigantic, big agricultural sheds. We painted them bright colors. Each front facade was different one from the other. And then what we did is we had a process of making little wooden maquettes of the front facades, and we would give each new church, we would give them one of these little maquettes that would then sit proudly next to the altar to describe with pride that what their church looked like. And these are some images of some of those churches, as you can see. Some of them still exist. I think most of them have been either changed into other uses. A lot of them were built in resettlement areas, which meant that after 1994, people left those resettlement areas and moved to the local towns, and the churches were just left empty in the farmlands and probably decayed. And a number of really simple buildings that we constructed also in these rural areas using a double roof system so you could ventilate the space between the two roofs and so on. Some of these got built, and then some of them just remained like this because we ran out of money. The problem that we had with the Anglican churches was split between white and black congregations. The whites were wealthy, they looked after themselves, and they gave nothing to the central diocese to support their black brothers and sisters in the townships, which meant that we had to rely on overseas money and funding or on Desmond Tutu's largesse with regard to his money. Some of the churches we did had to be, we were just talking recently now about the idea of beauty, and some congregations didn't like the kind of churches that we made, and they wanted very traditional churches. So we did a number of churches that kind of spoke to a language of church architecture that was familiar to people, with columns and columns of capitals and articular fronts and so on. This is one of the ones that we did, which is really just a shed, but it's got a highly decorated front with a lot of layering to the front. Again, I speak now from experience that when I look back on these buildings, the quality of construction is absolutely extraordinary. And all of these buildings were built by people. We didn't have building companies to build these buildings. They were built by subcontractors. And, we had a local carpenter in El Dorado Park who did the shuttering for these concrete capitals that we developed ourselves for this particular church. And we've continued doing churches, but no longer for a specific group. Every now and then we get a request to do something. This is a church we recently completed, which was interesting in the sense that the priest who commissioned us was an ex-architectural student of mine when I taught at Wits University. And he remembered St. Paul's Church that we built in Soweto as a student. When he graduated, and he graduated top of his class, he decided to enter the ministry and came to me and asked me whether he thought it was a good idea or not. And I said, well, you can only do one or the other. You can't do both together. So he entered the ministry, but then came to me afterwards and said, one day we'll build a church together and it'll be a circular building. Well, this is the one that we did, and we completed it 4 or 5 years ago. And it's outside Cape Town, and it does all the things that I think we were trying to do about a centralized church, bringing people together, bringing them around a centralized altar space, and so on. And what we did, which we didn't get right in our Soweto project, was the idea of acoustics. And in this case, we used a faceted brick wall as an acoustic wall, which gave us fantastic acoustics. This is used as a music venue in Somerset West. In a pretty dismal suburban site with not much interest to it. Adjacent to the site are the water tanks that the Somerset West use for their water supply. And it was really strange, but according to Gavin, the priest, someone came knocking on his door at this church asking whether this was where they paid their water bills, because I think they suspected that this building was just like the water tanks next door, which it probably was, but it was done subconsciously. So this is, for me, a kind of legacy from Desmond Tutu, this idea of building churches and people appreciating the churches we made, and we get these requests from people who remember 20, 30 years ago the churches we made in the most unpromising and unforgiving places imaginable. You can see the faceted wall, which is we designed to make the acoustics work. Okay, so that was my first, as an architect, was my first singular experience of practice, and I couldn't have wished for a better client. He is a remarkable man, and I think he'll live on in our memories, and hopefully some of these buildings won't just disappear, but they will remain there and become used for generations to come. The second person I want to talk to, which is more immediate, is Dennis Goldberg. And I was part of Dennis Goldberg's family in the sense that I married his niece and got to know him very well. And Dennis, if anyone knows about our history, was very involved in the struggle for freedom. He was actually the ANC's bomb maker, and his bomb-making skills were, funnily enough, honed through his education that he got at the University of Cape Town, where he graduated as an engineer. But these are Dennis's drawings, for example, that he was caught in, that were caught in his possession when he was arrested by the security police, and they show how to make a hand grenade, they show you how to make a bomb, and so on. But Dennis was arrested at Lily's Leaf Farm in the early 60s, together with the entire underground ANC leadership. You can see Nelson Mandela in the top left-hand corner, Dennis is on the bottom left-hand corner, and there were 11 of them that were sentenced to life imprisonment. These were the last surviving 4 members of the famous Rivonia trial, with Nelson Mandela and Dennis on the left-hand side. Now, what happened is Dennis, when he was released, went to the UK. He worked for the ANC as a fundraiser, returned to South Africa after liberation, and he worked for a couple of years as a political advisor to a couple of cabinet ministers, and then returned, came to live in Cape Town, moved into a site right nearby where I built him a house. And Dennis's whole idea was, and it became an obsession with him, was that the key to youth development is through arts and culture. That you give people a sense of their own worth when you introduce them, when you give them the freedom to express themselves in whatever way they see fit. So he started off in his retirement by running a series of arts programs in Hout Bay. He started up a brass band. He set up a music academy. He got people to run art classes. And we soon found that that was almost impossible to manage as a series of discrete projects. So we needed a place for where it could all happen. And Dennis, through perseverance, managed to convince the government of the Western Cape to give him a site, which is shown here. It's a very important heritage site in the middle of Hout Bay, with some important heritage buildings, including the Hout Bay History Museum, and a fantastic landscape with some trees a couple of 100 years old. So it was quite a difficult site for us to work in. And there were three main elements that went into the design of this building. All three of them were dealt with by Dennis in discussions with him over a 5-year period. He died, unfortunately, before we even started construction. So in a sense, I had to conduct a kind of conversation with Dennis's ghost during the construction period. But I knew him well enough, I think, to be able to be happy that what we were doing was what he wanted. The first thing that he wanted was open space. Being stuck in jail for 24 years left an indelible mark on him. And what he wanted was a building that would be open and that would not have corridors, and where you would always be aware of the outside. So what we did is we created a street that connected one side of the site to the other, and we disaggregated the scale of the main building, the House of Hope, into smaller discrete elements and placed them along the route. So we could connect old and new buildings together along a covered concrete canopy, which meant that whenever you had to go from one room to another, you always had to go outside to go inside again. And then the other idea, which is a literal translation of open space, is that this building opens at 8:30 in the morning and it closes at 5:30 in the afternoon, and it's open to anyone. There's no fee that you pay. You come into the building. Anyone can walk off the sidewalk into the building. The second idea was an idea that I think Dennis, he might have misappropriated it, but I still am not sure, because he referred to the idea of a social condenser. Now, architects use these words, but in Dennis's idea, a social condenser meant one space where simultaneously a whole range of different activities could happen, which I thought was a great idea. But what we didn't want to do was to make a tube of space. So what we did is in the main building, which you can see on the top, we had to accommodate a small art gallery, an exhibition space on Dennis's life, and a teaching space, together with an archive and a library. And what we did is we took that single space and we divided it into those 3 activity zones on the ground floor, differentiated them with a change in floor surface, and also differentiated them with regard to the ceiling and how we brought light in through the ceiling space. A series of drawings that I made just to look at how we might be able to use those spaces. And this gives an idea of the social condenser, if you want to call it that, with the ground floor with the art gallery, Dennis's exhibition, and a teaching space, and then a library and an archive on the top floor. So it's actually fantastic. People come to have a look at an exhibition on Dennis's life or look at the art exhibition, and there's a hip-hop session that's happening at the same time, and they get completely caught up with the kids and their exercises and what they're doing. So it really kind of consolidates that idea. But if you want to have a look at the art exhibition, you can find a space and you can do it, and you can read the art exhibition without having your space being interfered with. So it really does bring everything together very well, series of sections. And this upside-down axonometric shows you the articulation of the ceiling voids in that big space, and of how we folded that ceiling, the ceiling surface to accommodate the space that happened underneath, and how we brought special light in to suit the different needs underneath that roof. These are the people who built the building, the foreman on the left and the man who did the concrete work. I always feel that we wouldn't be architects if it wasn't, we wouldn't do nice buildings if it wasn't for good builders, and yet we seem to disregard them almost all the time. But in this case, these were local people working in small ways. We did have a main contractor, but most of the work was subcontracted, which meant that we could create work for local people as well on the building site. It made our life a misery, but that was fine. A view of, everyone knows Cape Town, it's the most beautiful city in the world, and I say that with unabashed pride. But this is Hout Bay, with the Hout Bay Harbour, and our little building, as you can see, is in the bottom corner there. But I think you can understand what I mean by a site with important buildings and an important landscape, and of how we fragmented the building form in order to fit it between existing trees and existing buildings. One of the difficulties of living in South Africa is that we have 11 official languages, and in the Western Cape we have 3 official languages, isiXhosa, English and Afrikaans. So everything has to be in 3 languages. So we decided to make a play of that on the front and have these medallions, and each one of them in a different language. The beginning of that walkway that I was talking about on the right-hand side is the History Museum. What we wanted originally to do was to make a loggia that was an open space that you could move through to get from one side of the site to the other, but we had to enclose it for fire regulations. But it didn't really matter because it still operates as a loggia, and an open one because the doors are left open right through the day. This was the first project that we did, which was a project that we did with Lalela, a non-profit art NGO, and we offered all the kids in Hout Bay, white and black. This is a site that sits between where the white people used to live, where the black people live, and where the colored people live. So we deal with all the kids. I mean, you have kids who come from really rich homes coming here to do art classes next to, really poor kids from a shack settlement just up the road. But what we did is we ran a portrait competition, and what we did is we offered to the kids the idea of Dennis's life. We showed a photograph of him, which you can see in the middle, and we said, we want you to imagine not just making a portrait of the man that looks like him, but we want to make a portrait of him that will describe his life and his contribution to the fight for freedom in our country. And then we chose 30, 40 of the best of the portraits and scanned them, and then stitched them together and made this gigantic 8-meter long mural that sits in the loggia. And so when you first enter the building, the first thing you see is this, and this tells you this is about kids and it's about art. And I think that serves the purpose for which it was intended. The other thing about Dennis, which we often discussed, and I'm sorry I didn't stay, I came in a bit late to the previous talk, which I thought was really good, was Dennis was a rationalist and an engineer, and he eschewed all trappings of luxury. He wasn't interested in it. Everything had to be necessary. And what we wanted to do was to deal with that value of Dennis's in the building, but then to find ways of taking necessary materials, dumb concrete, which for me is an inert material. It doesn't have any particular redeeming features unless you paint it, and then polish it, and then seal it, and it becomes something else. And I think it shifts it from being necessary to something more than necessary, and it takes it into the realm, I think, of luxury. And certainly many people have been to see this center. They all get taken by this kind of work that they see there. Similarly with the steel columns, which again were very necessary. Dennis was an engineer. They're 75mm diameter galvanized steel columns. We coated them with a mixture that we made on site, which gave the columns a milky color, but also made them very nice to touch. But they were still the necessary steel columns at the minimum size that we could make them. And then the interior space, and this is the art gallery looking towards the exhibition on Dennis's life, with the classroom in the middle, and then in the mezzanine on the top is the library and archive. The archive and the library above. and the kind of detail which I think is a very straightforward, no nonsense. And at the other end of the site is a small little classroom and a tuck shop where we give students who come here for after school classes, they get a glass of milk and a sandwich. And I just wanted to end off on this because both men were, and I knew them both well, were very unhappy with the course of events in South Africa since 1994. The corruption, the nepotism, the cronyism that has overtaken our country. We're in a dreadful state at the moment. But they didn't give up hope. Dennis always made the point that he believed in the ANC and the ANC's values. He didn't support the current government. And he wrote some very critical letters. Similarly, Desmond Tutu, just before he died, did the same thing. And I think these kind of little buildings offer a hope for us in the future in the sense that things are not right now, but these little buildings are just the beginnings of planting these little seeds that move us a little bit forward in a better direction than the one we're going in at the moment. And that's in a kind of that's in a way a tribute to these two men. Thank you. Okay. All right.
Joe, thank you very much for that.
Pleasure.
And what an extraordinary story, because you know, you've seen sets of relationships and the idea of togetherness from the apartheid era when you were doing that work with Desmond Tutu to then the post-apartheid era. And I wonder whether, well, the first question, obviously Desmond Tutu trusted you, a white architect, to work in black areas. And I wonder what the reaction of the local communities were. Was his authority enough to make that okay, or did you have to kind of prove your credentials? You, after it all, had been active yourself in the struggle against apartheid.
I never encountered any problems, never once. In fact, but I think it was working with the Anglican church communities that I worked in. People were bound together by a common faith. And I think race had nothing to do with it. It's only, believe it or not, since the ANC came to power and they've introduced black economic empowerment policies and they describe still everyone in terms of their race, that one tends to find now a certain kind of resistance directed towards white professionals, which is a real pity for me. But those days in the 1980s were heady days where people were bound together in the struggle to free the country. And it didn't care who you were or where you came from. If you were prepared to put in some effort, you were, given a place in that community. It was an amazing time.
Because I think there seems to be a current phenomenon, not just in the UK, that it's a sort of belief that unless you come from a particular race or community or possibly even class, that you can't understand the needs of a different one. I mean, this seems to me to be nonsense, and also rather dangerous nonsense, because it's a denial of the idea of a kind of a human creativity which can kind of supersede or kind of fly over or just bypass all those rather narrow definitions of who we are.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think that it's a travesty that should happen. I think where architects are guilty if they work in areas that they don't have much knowledge about is not taking enough time maybe to try and understand what the needs might be, what the cultural imperatives that particular group might be. But I think I've worked in so many different communities, with so many different people that, it sounds crazy, I'm from South Africa, but I don't think I'm white or black. I'm an architect, and I'll work for whoever needs my services. And fortunately, we're still surviving.
It's a curious thing that we didn't use really to have this discussion about class.
Yeah.
I mean, no one ever said that if an architect had working class backgrounds, they couldn't possibly design a country house for a rich person. And equally, I don't think anyone ever said, I'm thinking about, there are a few old Etonian architects in the UK, but the idea if they were old Etonians that they should be excluded from, say, designing social housing, I think will be so peculiar. And yet we seem to be moving towards that in things that are not to do with class, but things that are more visibly identifiable.
Yeah, look, I think so, but I would like to think it's a passing movement, and I think that there are in South Africa there are communities where white people are not trusted, and they're not trusted because of our particular history, and I suspect that happens even in the UK, and I think in those kinds of instances it's always useful to work with someone who's from that community who can act as a kind of bridgeheader for you. But I think to exclude people on the basis of either their race or their gender or their whatever is absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, I see it happening in the world today, and I think maybe it's going to last, but not for a long time, because actually we're all the same.
Because the irony is that it almost seems like a kind of splintering off of an apartheid idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
But instead of defining everybody by a sort of colour code, a kind of taxonomy about how dark you are, there's a sort of new taxonomy which was, well, do you come from there, or are you this, or are you that? I mean, it must feel rather peculiar to you having lived under that old regime, which was well, it wasn't exactly binary, was it? Because it was this almost biological attempt to define everybody, which was so curious, and you would say was doomed to failure.
Yeah.
But did you all think, when you were young, did you think it was all doomed? Did you think apartheid is definitely going to end, or did you sort of wake up in the morning and think, well, this is what it's going to be like? Because I guess the people who left South Africa, I assume that is what they thought.
Well, people leave South Africa for a lot of reasons, not least of which is fear. That when the so-called black people take over, they're going to run the whites into the sea. And that fear still exists. I mean, you know, we have a funny saying when we refer to Toronto in South Africa, we call it to run to. You know, there's this kind of movement of people in and out of South Africa. The problem at the moment is that the state still uses racial classification to describe people. And their reason for it is, and it's a kind of, I can buy it, but you know, it's being misused. It's to track the development of each racial group over time so that they can see whether effective development is happening in the black community. But it's back to the old apartheid days. I mean, we fill in forms for government work, and we have to describe who we are, what our race is, and how many people of how many different races we employ in our practice. We never had to do that under apartheid. You know, it was, so it's a crazy world, it really is. And I figure, you know, there's not much one can change it, because I think it's the course of history that we have to work our way through all these issues. But I can't see it as being sustainable at all. And I look back and I see what's happening in England and the kind of stuff that's happening in the rest of the world in America, and I'm appalled. I mean, I really am. I think in South Africa, we're still the better place to live.
Can I turn to some of your architecture, because you showed some delightful, mainly small projects, but of course you've done much bigger projects, and I remember the award you won, the RIBA International Award. This must be 10 or 15 years ago now, I guess, for that remarkable work outside Johannesburg. Yeah. Would you like to say something about, from an architectural point of view, going from those small projects with no money to going to larger projects, and whether actually your kind of architectural impulse was the same, or did it broaden or expand? How did that work, or did you just take it as it came?
You just take it as it comes. You know, we run a very small practice. One of my partners, Ivandro Schwalbach, is here. And if we take on big projects and small projects, I mean, we've just completed the conversion of a 27-story hotel building right next to the Cape Town International Convention Centre, converted it into a 650-bed hotel. And we couldn't manage the project, so we worked with a bigger practice who helped us do the work. You know, maybe some architects have an ability to do really beautiful small work. When they do bigger work, it becomes a problem. I think we are architects. We take on all things. But the red location project is in a sad way at the moment because the Port Elizabeth local government has collapsed, doesn't work anymore. And they just abandoned the buildings because of a dispute that they had with the local community about housing that had nothing to do with our museum. And we were about to be appointed to renovate these buildings, and the day that the appointment was meant to be signed, the manager of the city got arrested for corruption, and she was the one who was most prepared to sign our letter of appointment. So that's now gone. That's the kind of life you live in South Africa.
Because we should say that the Red Locations project was a sort of museum of apartheid, wasn't it? It had a most beautiful chapel within it. But let me conclude by saying when I visited it, my sort of abiding memory of this project, it's a museum in which exhibits are placed into, essentially, they're sort of like small warehouses. So you can see that this is very architectural, but it's also cheap as chips. And the actual exhibits were so moving because when black South Africans were moved from a town to mining communities or stuff like that in the 19th century and ongoing, what they would take with them was called a memory box. And it might just be a scrap of cloth, it might be a photograph, it would just be some little memories of home, of real home. And of course, what you did is, I don't have to tell you, but I'm just thinking about. So what was so compelling about this building was that there were, of course, examples of memory boxes on display, but they were on display in these structures, which of course themselves have become memory boxes of this wider whole. So you got this very, very unusual example of life and architecture and memory and history being both saved and commemorated, but also, as it were, proclaiming in a way that made the distinction between the design and the memory completely fluid. That's why it's got the inaugural RIBA International Award. It's one of the most powerful buildings I've ever seen, and yet it wasn't extravagant. And my sense is that, having seen some drawings of the photos of your hotel, that same attitude. I mean, after all, what's a hotel but 650 boxes within a larger box? It certainly won't have the same kind of spiritual feel as Red Locations did, but I think it has the same fundamental architectural attitude. Joe Noero, thank you very much.
Thank you.